Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Ladar Gavelazi, and coming up in today's newscast. As the Delta variant continues to spread across the world, is Israel on the verge of a fourth wave? Rivlins ends his 7-year term as Israel's president, as Yitzhak Herzog is sworn in as the country's 11th president. And the coalition fails to reach a majority on legislation again. As the Delta variant continues to spread across Israel and daily cases reach new highs not seen since March, health officials are now recommending new restrictions. What those restrictions entail, and with more on the coronavirus cabinet meetings, ILTV's Hannah Rifkin reporting.
The Delta variant continuing to sweep across Israel. The coronavirus cabinet meeting again Wednesday, deciding not to impose any new restrictions despite the rise in infections. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett making remarks at the opening of the meeting.
העולם כרגע מתמודד עם גל עצום של זן דלטה שמכה במדינות שונות בעולם. המטרה שלנו בממשלה זה להמשיך לנהל ברוגע ועל בסיס מידע ועובדות את המשך ההתמודדות מול הקורונה וזן הדלטה בפרט, לאור הנתונים שיש לנו. אנחנו שואפים למקסימום הגנה על תושבי ישראל ועל הבריאות שלהם, לצד מינימום הפרעה לשגרת החיים ולפגיעה כלכלית.
According to numbers released by the Health Ministry Wednesday morning, the number of new coronavirus cases in Israel reaching 521, the second day in a row with over 500 cases. Yesterday at 501, marking the highest number of daily cases since March. The number of those in serious condition also on the rise, number of patients in serious condition, now at 40. Meanwhile, the coronavirus cabinet also convened Tuesday night to hear a list of recommendations from the health ministry. However, they did not reach any decisions as the meeting was cut short due to ongoing voting in the Knesset plenum. As for the new restrictions that were on the table, only going into effect if Israel reaches 1,000 cases per day, include some controversial measures. First, quarantine for parents, even if they're vaccinated, if one of their children is required to go into quarantine. Then, as for travel restrictions, the cabinet will need to decide whether to ask passengers returning from abroad to take a second coronavirus test 4 days after they return, as travelers are currently required to take a PCR test upon arrival into Israel only. And then lastly, the health ministry also wanting to expand the list of red countries and require a 2-week quarantine for travelers returning from some 20 countries with high coronavirus rates, and this would apply to all travelers, whether vaccinated or not. Yet despite the recommendations by health officials warning that as of next week, Israel could likely face 1,000 new patients daily, the coronavirus cabinet deciding not to implement any significant new measures, not even in Ben Gurion International Airport. Instead, the cabinet deciding to continue with the public relations campaign, urging youth and those who have yet to receive the vaccine to go and get vaccinated. The government also approving rapid testing for geriatric facilities and for summer camps with more than 100 children. And so it seems that Naftali Bennett's policy of maximum protection and minimum restrictions is still in effect for now.
The coronavirus, it seems, is here to stay, at least for the near future, as Israel's battling a new rise in cases mainly due to the Delta variant sweeping across the country. While officials in the health ministry are calling to impose new measures, the coronavirus cabinet, it seems, is not in any rush to place new restrictions on Israelis, who have grown accustomed to life without the coronavirus these past few weeks. Here to discuss is Director of the MA Program for Public Health at the University of Haifa, Professor Manfred Green. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I think the question on everyone's mind at the moment is Israel on the verge of a fourth wave?
I think, again, we need to explain what we mean by these waves. These waves are not automatic phenomena that just occur because of the virus. Most of the time, we create them. Basically, what happens is the cases, well, the rates of the cases, numbers of cases increases. We introduce restrictions, they decline. And then we reduce the restrictions, they go up again. In this case, we've introduced a vaccine, and the vaccine obviously has changed the whole atmosphere and the whole scene. So basically now we are well protected against severe disease, but we still have a large percentage of the population who are not protected, mainly children, and probably about 1 million people who are still, among adults, who've still not taken the vaccine. So that can create these increases, but we probably won't see large numbers of serious cases.
So health officials are calling to impose new restrictions. I mean, do you think that they should be imposing new restrictions at this stage?
There are two reasons basically why we are concerned about the virus spreading. One obviously is that it increases the risk of spread to people who are not protected, and some of them are either elderly or they didn't develop immunity due to, in their vaccine doses, which is about a couple of percent. And the other, of course, is the more the vaccine circulates, the more chance there is of creating what we call variants, new kinds of, new forms of the virus. So basically, I believe we still should have restrictions. For example, wearing masks is considered to be now a very good and effective way of reducing the spread, generally in closed spaces where people are actually in public areas and they are in contact with the public, and the place is closed, like classrooms and theaters and wherever you may be. So I think those are very important. And as much as possible to restrict the large gatherings, because I think we're still at a stage where we shouldn't be having too many of these very large gatherings. Again, in closed spaces. If it's out in the open, it's much better.
So there does seem to be debate about whether new restrictions should be imposed or not. Masks, you mentioned, is something that I think everyone can agree on. What about travel restrictions? I mean, we've seen that the Delta variant, which is now spreading across Israel, has essentially come from abroad. Should we be imposing travel restrictions?
Yeah, well, the Delta variant is here, so I mean, it's too late to stop it from coming in, and it'll become probably the dominant variant as elsewhere. The question is whether we really want to restrict travel to the extent that it really becomes very problematic for actually having a normal life and a normal society. So I think we have to be very careful about introducing restrictions that are going to be, shall we say, too onerous on the population. The other thing, one point that I want to make, once these restrictions are introduced, it's very important that there are the technical administrative aspects that are dealt with. For example, telling people that when they come back from abroad, they have to go and have a test 4 days later and so on. That means that the government should provide the facilities that are convenient and cheap. I would say free, basically. In other words, open large numbers of testing centers and make them available free to the public. That, I think, would be a good deal.
All right, Professor Manfred Green, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Pleasure.
Reuven Rivlin ending his 7-year term in office, he was a beloved president to many Israelis, and he faced unprecedented obstacles and challenges throughout his tenure: the coronavirus, the gaps in Israeli society, 5 Israeli elections, and the loss of his wife, among many more. So, here to discuss Rivlin's legacy is former Canadian ambassador to Israel, Vivian Belkovici. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. So I want to get into the specifics in a minute, but more generally, if you had to sum up his term as president, what do you think Rivlin's lasting legacy will be?
I think he was a breath of fresh air as president, somewhat iconoclastic, and I think his lasting legacy will be to have brought some degree of unity, democratization to the role. He's not, he's a very friendly, open, inclusive sort of person, which isn't to say that those before him were not. But he's avuncular. He's got a lovely manner about him, very down to earth. And I think he made the office and the role seem very accessible and down to earth.
What do you think were the major highlights of his presidency? I mean, what particularly stood out to you?
There were so many things that stood out. The first thing that comes to mind is that he had a tough presidency in many ways because of all the political goings on, but that he came very close to the line at some points of politicizing the role much more than it should be. I'm not saying he did, because I don't think he did, but he came close. And that was kind of, of necessity, because he was president during extraordinary circumstances. He also really opened the doors, to everyone, and I think people felt included. That's Arab Israeli citizens, Jewish Israelis, Druze Israelis. During the passage of the nation-state law, when the Druze were expressing their extreme dissatisfaction with it, President Rivlin really stood up for minority interests and spoke eloquently in their defense.
And I also want to touch upon his successor, Isaac Herzog. What awaits him in his first few months in office? I mean, what are some of the major challenges that he's going to have to address?
Unity is the major challenge he has to address. And I think that he has a vision for what he wants to accomplish, I'm sure. I expect that reaching out to minorities in Israel will be an important thing for him to do based on his values and how we've seen him, to date in his various roles. And when I say unity, I mean, it's not a simplistic sort of slogan. I mean, I think that Israel needs to find a way to, citizens in Israel need to find a constructive way to speak to one another and to bridge differences and not politicize everything. And I think that Herzog is a very, very strong candidate to succeed at doing that. It's a tough, tough task. And with respect to, to the degree that the president, which is quite a bit, interacts with the diaspora, with the, world outside of Israel, the broader world outside of Israel, he's very, very capable and well equipped to do that.
Now, in your role as ambassador, did you ever have a personal experience with him that you'd like to share?
Interesting you should ask. I do. So I was appointed January 2014, and very shortly after I was appointed, Prime Minister Harper, then Prime Minister Harper of Canada, came to Israel for a fantastic visit. And at the time, Bougie, as he's known, President Herzog, as he's now going to be known, he was the leader of the Labour Party. We were meeting, I can't remember, one of those, there were so many meetings and functions. And I met his wife, and I realized she looked familiar, and she had gone to my high school in Toronto. We'd been at the same high school. I guess her family had lived in Toronto for a number of years when she was a teenager. And the next day we met again, Bougie and I, and he came with a page of the yearbook, the high school yearbook, with my name circled and his autograph, which could be worth a lot more these days.
So Ambassador Vivian Bercovici, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
Now, in other news, while Americans celebrated Independence Day on July 4th here in Israel, the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem held its annual celebrations on Tuesday night. In making remarks at the event, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who said he would challenge any attempt to make Israel a partisan issue in the United States. Let's take a look.
Israelis and Americans gathered Tuesday night at the 24th Independence Day celebrations at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett addressed the crowd in his first official speech to an American audience, thanking U.S. President Joe Biden for his commitment to Israel and reaffirming the U.S.-Israeli friendship.
Israelis across the political spectrum are fundamentally pro-American. We like America. We appreciate, we admire what you're doing out there. And that's the way it ought to be also in America vis-a-vis Israel. And I'll challenge any attempt to make America a partisan political issue in Israel, and any attempt to make Israel a partisan political issue in the United States.
Bennett's statement comes at a time of increasing animosity within the U.S. Democratic Party, as numerous Democrats have been overly critical of Israel and its policies, while critics of Benjamin Netanyahu accused him of diminishing Israel's relationship with the Democratic Party during his time as Prime Minister. Yet at the embassy event, there was a strong show of solidarity between Israel and the US. Following Bennett on stage was Democratic Party House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Gregory Meeks, who arrived in Israel for the celebrations along with a bipartisan congressional delegation.
That the United States of America, the United States Congress, especially the United States House of Representatives, we're not here and strong with Israel because of politics. We're here because of values. And Israel and the United States and the United States Congress, we share the same values. So that is an unbreakable bond between you and us.
Meeks also had reassuring words of support for Israel regarding a number of key security issues.
So let me make it plain. We're going to lock arm in arm with you, Mr. Prime Minister, to make sure that Iran doesn't get its way. We're going to lock arm in arms with you to make sure that Hamas doesn't get its way. We're going to lock arm in arms with you to make sure that the historic moment that is upon us with the Abraham Accords, that we get more people to join and say Israel has the right to exist, and we're going to work with them hand in hand. It's a historic moment today.
Now, Israel can only hope that the warm sentiments will continue to translate into action as Bennett prepares to meet with his U.S. counterpart, President Joe Biden.
The new coalition has gotten off to a shaky start as it failed to pass the controversial family reunification law after falling short of the majority. And this seems to be a recurring problem with regards to legislation, as yet another bill regarding IDF service for religious women was pulled due to a lack of votes. Here to discuss the ramifications and what this means for future votes is advocate Ziv Ma'or, legal counsel for the Halel Likud Forum and Im Tirtzu, and Jeremy Saltan, a political strategist and director of English operations of the Yamina Party. Welcome. So Jeremy, let's start with you. Amichai Chikli from the Yamina Party voted against his own coalition. Prime Minister Bennett saying he was confused, right? And yet this seems to be a recurring problem with legislation being pulled at the last minute due to a lack of majority. I mean, what went wrong? And will the coalition be able to sort of, pull itself together and pass legislation in the future?
Well, you mentioned Amichai Chikli being a member of the coalition. He is not a member of the coalition. He is a member of our party. He chose to vote against the formation of this government. We've had arrangement with him in which he's been allowed to go ahead and vote his conscience as long as he lets us know what he was going to vote before the vote. In this case, so what he had told us was he was going to vote with the coalition. In the end, he chose to vote with the opposition. Because of that, we ended up losing that vote. So that just, explains what happened in that particular case. As in every coalition that has 61 MKs, dating back to Rivlins' first term as prime minister in the 1970s, you're going to have situations where on things that are considered, very hot button topics, you will occasionally lose a vote, or you'll have to go ahead and pull a piece of legislation and then bring it back when you're able to go ahead and secure the votes. This is not the first time that we're going through this, and also not in recent history. Back in 2015, the last time that Netanyahu was able to form a normal government, that was a 61 MK coalition, and you had many of these situations happening over the first year. I'm quite confident as this coalition moves along, we will be able to increase the number of members in the coalition from 61 to a larger number. And by doing so, we'll have less of these issues moving forward. The timeline of that is probably going to be after we pass the state budget and everyone understands that we have a clear indication of staying here for at least a couple of good years.
Now, we'll get back to one of your points in a minute, but Ziv, we're talking about the coalition, but the opposition, right, led by the Likud, voted against a law that ultimately they believe in, solely for politics, a law that jeopardizes Israel's security. This is the epitome of putting politics over everything else. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when you talk about the epitome of putting politics in front of everything else, we must complain about this coalition, but let's discuss whether or not and to what extent is this law designed to protect Israel's security. Now, it is a complicated issue, and it is not the right thing to do to oversimplify it, but I'll try to do it either way. What the law says is that the Minister of Interior, that is Ayelet Shaked, has full discretion about whether or not a person is entitled for a status of resident in the State of Israel. Now, when this discussion was implied in the early 2000s during the Intifada, the Supreme Court had illegal questions about it. They mentioned that there are certain sorts of considerations that a minister is not allowed to have. Now, a proper minister would have said to the court, so what? The law authorizes me and I practice the law. But the coalition of 2003, which initiated this law in the beginning, submitted itself completely to the court and legislated a law that needs to be legislated every year again and again and again. Now, since 2003 until now, there was no problem with this practice because it was a consensual law. But this coalition, which is formed of mainly leftist elements, does not allow and does not willing to support this act. They have to rely on the opposition. But the reason that the Likud party allowed itself to object to a policy that basically they support is that this specific legislation is not needed. The Minister of Interior, Ayelet Shaked, presents itself as a right-wing proponent politician, should use its authority within the law. And when there is a candidate that is not suitable, according to her consideration, to become a resident of Israel, she has the right to deny that. There is no need for this legislation. There is no need for the Likud to support it. By proposing this law, she basically acknowledges the fact that the entity that controls it is the court, which is not the legal case.
Okay,
so
I'm going to stop you there because I want to go back to sort of the bigger picture. Jeremy, we're almost out of time, so I want to hear final thoughts from you and final thoughts from Ziv. I mean, do you think Bennett will be able to get his house in order, so to speak? And what needs to be done now so that you will be able to pass legislation in the future?
I already addressed that in my previous point. I need to really respond to what I just heard here because it's just ridiculous and it's just not true. It's not a piece of legislation. It's a temporary order. It's been around for 18 years, the last 12 years. During the Netanyahu government, it has been extended over and over again. There's nothing different between now compared to before. It's a matter of national security. The Shin Bet, not me, not Naftali Bennett, not Ayelet Shaked, the Shin Bet said there is a necessity for this temporary order to be extended, and the Likud decided to put the issue of national security into the category of politicizing it and go ahead and make all of these baseless allegations when they themselves saw the very opinion that was sent by the Shin Bet, and because of that opinion, they spent 12 years in the Netanyahu government extending it time after time. So I'm just very, very upset to see that really the only thing the Likud can do at this point to go ahead and stop from the embarrassment of they themselves being the ones that voted with Ahmed Tibi and with Balad is to go ahead and try to say that it doesn't matter and we didn't need the legislation anyways. Well, again, if we didn't need this temporary order and we didn't need to extend it, then it's very clear that Netanyahu would not have done it the last 12 years.
All right.
And I'm sorry, do not...
Ziv, I want to give you the chance because we're out of time. Ziv, one sentence, final thoughts.
Well, I'd say, as I said in the beginning, this is a complicated issue. It is being oversimplified by both sides. But at the end of the day, yes, I stand behind what I said. Legally, the goal of this legislation can be executed by the Minister of Interior without this legislation. And there are reasons for the Likud, the governments, to do it all along. There are good reasons for the fact that the Likud objects it right now. At the end of the day,
politics.
All right, Jeremy Sultan, Advocate Ziv Mo, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
You're welcome.
Now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Hannah Rifkin.
Well, happy Wednesday. It's my favorite day of the week, and clear skies are staying with us. Tonight's temperature lows warm still in the 20s and upper teens. Then tomorrow, highs are expected to reach mostly the 30s. Now, back to the studio with Lidar.
All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.27 shekels to the American dollar and 2.63 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm the Dargaveh Lazi. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.